All right, folks, Ted Hartwell here, retired ranger, and I'm going to break this down the way we'd brief it in the TOC. Today, we're looking at Ukraine in the dead of winter, not just the weather, but the entire strategic situation. The core question everyone's asking is simple. Can Ukraine survive this winter without being forced into a surrender deal? And what do these February 1st peace talks in Abu Dhabi actually tell us about where this war is headed? Why now? Because we're watching two campaigns unfold simultaneously. On the diplomatic front, Trump's envoys just finished the first ever trilateral talks between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. They're calling it constructive. On the ground, Russia launched 375 drones and 21 missiles during those same negotiations, knocking out power across Kyiv while diplomats were shaking hands in the UAE. That timing is not coincidence. That's Putin showing exactly who holds leverage. Let me walk you through what's actually happening on the ground and why the next 60 days are going to be decisive. Here's the risk assessment. This winter represents the sternest test Ukraine's infrastructure has faced since the full-scale invasion began nearly 4 years ago. We're not talking about rolling blackouts anymore. We're talking about a systematic campaign to collapse the grid entirely. Temperatures in Kyiv dropped to -19 Celsius last week. That's about -2 Fahrenheit for those of you stateside. When you combine that kind of cold with a power grid operating at 60% capacity, you get a humanitarian crisis that has direct military implications. Civilians freezing in their apartments puts pressure on Zelensky that no amount of Western solidarity can fully offset. This is Russia weaponizing winter the same way they've always done, going back to Napoleon, going back to the Wehrmacht. The terrain hasn't changed, neither has the strategy. Let's talk about the energy situation in concrete terms, because the numbers tell the story. Before the war, Ukraine had 56.1 gigawatts of installed generation capacity. Today, they're down to somewhere between 11 and 14 gigawatts available at any given time. That's a loss of 27 gigawatts, roughly half the country's pre-war capacity, either occupied, destroyed, or damaged beyond quick repair. Now here's the problem. Peak winter demand hits 17 to 18.5 gigawatts when the temperature drops. That means Ukraine is running a deficit of 3 to 6 gigawatts on the coldest days. To put that in perspective, that shortfall is equivalent to Denmark's entire peak electricity demand. You can't run a modern economy, let alone a wartime defense industry, with that kind of gap. Zelensky declared a state of emergency in the energy sector on January 15th for a reason. Russia has adapted their targeting doctrine, and this is critical to understand. In previous winters, they focused on power plants, big, visible targets that Ukraine could repair with Western help. This winter, they've shifted to substations. Ukraine has approximately 3,500 electrical substations scattered across the country. These are the nodes that distribute power from generators to consumers. They're smaller, harder to defend, faster to hit, and their destruction cascades through the entire grid. When you take out a substation, you don't just lose one facility. You isolate entire regions from whatever generation capacity remains. The first Deputy Energy Minister put it bluntly, you can't carry electricity in buckets. If the substation linking western Ukraine's nuclear plants to eastern cities goes down, it doesn't matter how much power you're generating, it's not reaching the people who need it. Russia figured this out, and they're exploiting it methodically. The sticking point is Donbass. And I want to be precise about what that means on the ground. Russia currently controls approximately 77% of Donetsk Oblast and nearly all of Luhansk. Putin has made full control of the remaining Donbass a non-negotiable demand. That remaining chunk is roughly the size of Delaware, about 5,000 square kilometers, and it includes several population centers that Ukrainian forces have held for 4 years of grinding combat. Zelensky has said repeatedly that Ukraine will not surrender at the negotiating table what its troops have denied Russia on the battlefield. There's your irreconcilable gap. Now, if scenario A holds and some creative formulation emerges, perhaps a de facto recognition of Russian control without formal sovereignty, then you might see movement. But if scenario B dominates, and Putin insists on explicit Ukrainian withdrawal from territories Russia hasn't actually seized, then we're watching theater, not diplomacy. The battlefield will continue to set the terms. The security guarantee question is equally thorny. France and Britain signed a declaration pledging to establish military hubs across Ukraine and deploy several thousand troops after any ceasefire. That sounds reassuring until you factor in Putin's categorical rejection of any NATO forces on Ukrainian soil. The Russian position hasn't budged. No NATO membership, no Western troops, period. Witkoff and Kushner met with Putin in Moscow, then flew to Davos, then facilitated the Abu Dhabi talks. Lots of movement, lots of meetings, but no indication Russia has softened on this red line. Germany's Chancellor Merz captured the European mood when he said German forces might monitor a ceasefire, but would be based in a neighboring country, not Ukraine itself. So we have a situation where the security guarantees Ukraine needs to feel protected are precisely the guarantees Russia will not accept. If some creative workaround emerges, perhaps non-NATO multinational forces or U.S. monitoring without boots on the ground, then progress is possible. If not, any ceasefire becomes a pause, not a settlement. Putin rearms, Ukraine remains vulnerable, and we do this again in 3 years. Let me assess the consequences across several domains. First, security. If Ukraine's energy grid suffers cascading failures this winter, you'll see population displacement accelerate. Millions of Ukrainians have already left the country. Another wave would strain European absorption capacity and potentially weaken domestic support for continued aid. That plays directly into Russia's information warfare strategy. Second, the economic dimension. Ukraine's GDP growth is capped at 2% for 2026, and the main constraint isn't funding. It's energy and workforce shortages. Major industrial producers like Ferrexpo, the iron ore giant, cut pellet production by 47% last year because their plants couldn't get reliable power. That's not just a Ukrainian problem. Those pellets supply steelmakers in Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic. European supply chains are getting hit by this war in ways most consumers don't see. Third, consider the diplomatic implications. If the February talks collapse and Trump grows frustrated with the pace of negotiations, there's a real risk of U.S. disengagement. European leaders have been explicit about this fear. The Polish president told CNBC that regardless of whether a peace deal is signed, Russia will remain a threat. If peace is signed, Russia regroups. If not, the war continues. Finland's president said his country has been practicing this since 1917, and we got this. But even Finnish confidence has limits without a credible U.S. backstop. The transatlantic relationship is being stress-tested in real time, and the outcome will shape European security architecture for decades. If Trump cuts a bad deal or walks away, Europe has to decide whether it can defend the eastern flank alone. The answer right now is probably no, but that calculus is changing fast. Fourth, there's the manpower equation, and this matters for both sides. Russia is sustaining approximately 30,000 casualties per month, killed and wounded combined. That's a staggering rate of attrition, but Moscow keeps finding bodies to throw into the fight. North Korean troops have already suffered an estimated 4,000 casualties, roughly a third of the initial deployment, and reports suggest another 25,000 may be en route. Ukraine, for its part, has acknowledged 45,100 military deaths, with reports that 50,000 reservists are being filtered into frontline brigades to replace losses. Neither side is running out of will, but both are running through their trained manpower at rates that historically precede either negotiated settlements or dramatic escalations. Something has to give, and the timeline is probably measured in months, not years. Here are the indicators I'm watching over the next 60 days. First, grid stability in February. If Ukraine suffers a nationwide blackout or loses more than 2 major substations per week, the pressure on Zelensky to accept unfavorable terms will intensify dramatically. Watch the emergency import numbers and the frequency of rolling blackouts in Kyiv specifically. Second, Russian messaging after February 1st. If Kremlin spokesmen pivot from constructive language to hard-line statements about liberating all of Donbass by force, that signals Putin has concluded diplomacy won't deliver what he wants, and military pressure will continue. Third, European troop commitments. Concrete announcements of specific force numbers, deployment timelines, and command structures would signal that the coalition of the willing is serious. Vague pledges don't count. Fourth, watch North Korean troop movements. Satellite imagery and intelligence leaks about additional deployments to Kursk would indicate Russia is doubling down on the attritional approach rather than conserving forces for a post-ceasefire posture. Fifth, Trump's public statements. If the president starts expressing frustration with Zelensky rather than Putin, that's a leading indicator of potential U.S. policy shifts that would fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. Finally, sixth indicator, and this is one most analysts overlook, watch Ukrainian domestic polling on territorial concessions. If public opinion softens on the question of trading land for peace, that gives Zelensky political room to negotiate he currently doesn't have. If public opinion hardens, he's locked into a position that may not be militarily sustainable. So here's my assessment, and I'll give it to you straight. Russia is using winter as a weapon of coercion, systematically destroying Ukraine's power grid to create a humanitarian catastrophe that pressures Kyiv into accepting a deal on Moscow's terms. That's the strategy, and it's working to an extent. Civilians are suffering, the economy is contracting, and the pressure is real. But the logistics of occupation and the demonstrated resilience of Ukrainian resistance suggest Putin's timeline for achieving his maximalist goals is far longer than Trump's patience. We're in a window where diplomatic outcomes are genuinely uncertain, and the next 60 days will likely determine whether this war moves toward a frozen conflict, an unfavorable settlement for Ukraine, or continued attritional warfare through the summer. The ground hasn't decided yet. Neither have the principles. Stay sharp. Pay attention to the indicators I mentioned. And don't let the diplomatic theater distract you from what's happening on the power lines and the front lines. That's where this war is actually being fought. That's the brief. Stay sharp out there.